So maybe this morning this is deja vu all over again, or maybe it's like that movie Groundhog Day, where you think you've heard this sermon before, and you have. Maybe not exactly in the same form, but you may think that while listening to this sermon this morning that I'm sounding like a bit like a broken record, and maybe I am. And yet it's so important that I'm going to say it again. The greatest challenge we face today is not war or economic inequality, community unrest or prejudice or division. The greatest challenge we face is fear. Why? Because fear is at the root of all these other things. Think about it. Go all the way back to the Pharaoh in the first chapters of Exodus. Or maybe you want to think about the Roman Caesars or even authoritarian rulers of our day. They rule by means of fear. Fear is how we turn those who are in some fashion different from us into an enemy, people against whom we should make war. Fear causes us to hoard stuff because we assume that we will never have enough. And we see those around us as competitors for scarce resources. Fear drives wedges of distrust into our communities, and they fracture solidarity and compassion in community. Fear causes us to define ourselves over against those around us, not by what we share, but by what makes us different. Fear creates an either-or, us or them mentality that makes it nearly impossible to find common ground, let alone see each other with any sense of empathy. In fact, organizational behavior specialist Ron Heifetz believes that fear is at the heart of why we bristle about change. He says it's not change that we don't like. Rather, we fear losing something that's important to us in the change that inevitably comes along. Fear drives us inward, hardens our hearts, darkens our vision, and stunts our imagination. Which is why I say that the greatest challenge we face today is fear. And as poignant and profound as that, and painful as that observation feels to me just now, it likely has always been true. Why else is the most common command in the entire scriptures, do not fear? In fact, those three words are spoken over 120 times across the biblical narrative. Some angel or priest or prophet or absolutely ordinary person says, usually speaking on behalf of God, do not fear. There's a similar message embedded in the opening paragraph of today's gospel lesson. Listen. Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise up your heads because your redemption is drawing near. It's a promise that's easy for us to miss because when Jesus mentions these things, he's referring to foreboding signs in the earth and the heavens, distress and tumult among people, the powers of the day being shaken, the coming apocalyptic Son of Man in power and glory. And so all those words about cataclysm and catastrophes and chaos, that's what we tend to focus on, and we roll right over these words of promise. And I get it, no wonder. It's scary stuff that Jesus is talking about. And yet in the midst of all that chaos and cataclysm and catastrophe, the stuff about which Jesus says people will faint with foreboding and fear about what is coming upon the earth, Jesus tells his followers, stand up, raise up your heads. Why? Not because Jesus is suggesting that the end of the world is near and those who are faithful will be taken to their eternal victory. No. He says it's because heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And what are those words? Well, take note of where in Luke's gospel we are reading from today. It's chapter 21, and in the very next chapter, Jesus will enter Jerusalem triumphantly, and he will commence those last epic days of his life. Given the proximity of this scene and the soon-to-begin passion of Jesus, his death and resurrection, it seems reasonable to look there for an answer. So take your pick. This is my body. This is my blood given for you. Jesus' promise of his continued and real presence with his disciples. Or how about this one? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Jesus' promise of forgiveness, no matter what. Or how about this one? Today you will be with me in paradise. Jesus' promise of eventual rest and comfort. Or peace be with you. Jesus promised that his resurrection spells an end to death and the cycle of violence and revenge. You are witnesses to these things. How about that one? Jesus promises purposeful and fruitful work for his disciples to spread the message of goodwill and peace articulated at the very beginning of the gospel. Across the board, Jesus promises never to abandon his disciples. No matter what the tumult and the trauma and the drama of the world, Jesus promises to be with his disciples, to strengthen them, encourage them, and equip them. Not merely to endure the challenges that face them, but to flourish. Jesus promises not to eliminate fear or hardship from the lives of the disciples, either then or now. But rather, Jesus promises to create in us courage, the ability to be faithful, to do one's duty, to retain vision and compassion and empathy, even when we are tempted to be afraid. Which means, dear brothers and sisters, we are not helpless. While we still await Jesus' redemption, we have good work to do in the meantime. And we undertake the good work of being Jesus' disciples in the world, being compassionate to those who are hurting, encouragement to those who are afraid, solidarity with those who are oppressed, resistance to evil, forgiveness for those who have wronged us, and acceptance of all God's people. Not because we believe that our actions will change the world, because we know that Christ's resurrection has already changed the world. Rather, we live and behave in the confidence that Jesus' promises are trustworthy. Maybe that doesn't seem like enough to you. Maybe it seems to you like all of our little deeds of compassion and encouragement and solidarity and resistance and forgiveness and acceptance are too small. Too small to make any difference. But in light of Jesus' promise, there are no small deeds. There are only actions motivated by the love of Jesus that inhabits our hearts. No deed done in love and courage, no matter how small, is ever wasted. It is not our job to save the church, to save the world, dear church. Jesus has already not only promised to save the world, but he's done it in his death and resurrection. And so it is our job merely and yet powerfully to care for those in our little corners of the world that we happen to inhabit. It is our job to make our lives an alternative to the fear that so corrodes the world. Living in courage, acting compassionately, we are obedient to Christ's command. Now, when you see these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near.